Welcome to our channel, Hollywood Movie Review. King of New York 1990 Movie Review. King of New York is a 1990 neo-noir crime film directed by Abel Ferrara and written by Nicholas St. John. It stars Christopher Walken, Laurence Fishburne, David Caruso, Victor Argo, and Wesley Snipes, with supporting roles played by Giancarlo Esposito, Steve Buscemi, Paul Calderone, Janet Julian, and Teresa Randall. Walken portrays Frank White, a New York City drug kingpin rebuilding his criminal empire after his release from prison, while also attempting to go legitimate. The film was released by Carolco Pictures through New Line Cinema on September 28, 1990. It received mixed reviews from critics, with several criticizing the film's violence and dark tone. Retrospective reviews have been much more positive, and the film has been described as one of Ferrara's best. Drug lord Frank White strives to control New York City's criminal underground. Shortly after his release from Sing Sing Penitentiary, White and his crew, led by his trigger-happy right-hand man Jimmy Jump, consolidate power by eliminating their rivals in the Colombian drug cartel and triad. White personally executes a mafia boss who refuses to cooperate with him. White's exploits catch the attention of the NYPD's narcotics squad. Detectives Bishop, Gilly, and Flanagan confront White but lack any tangible evidence to arrest him. They instead turn their attention to White's henchmen, whom they arrest after a surviving member of the Colombian drug cartel agrees to cooperate with the police. White's lawyers intervene and free the men from jail. Gilly and Flanagan, extremely frustrated at White's use of the law to dodge justice, decide to simply murder White and his crew. They storm a nightclub where White is partying and kill many of his men. White and Jump survive the raid but are chased by Gilly and Flanagan. Jump ambushes and mortally wounds Flanagan. Gilly is unable to resuscitate his partner, and shoots Jump in the head in a fit of rage. A grief-stricken Gilly attends Flanagan's funeral, where he is abruptly assassinated by White in a drive-by shooting. White then confronts Detective Bishop in his own apartment. He holds him at gunpoint while explaining that he eliminated the Colombian drug cartel and triad in New York City because he disapproved of their involvement in human trafficking and child prostitution. White restrains Bishop to a chair and leaves. Bishop uses a gun in from nearby drawer and frees himself and chases White into the subway. Both men draw guns on each other, but White uses an innocent bystander as a human shield. The two exchange gunfire and Bishop is killed. White exits the subway and makes his way to a taxi in Times Square. He clutches a gunshot wound to his torso and watches as police surround his taxi. White goes limp as the police close in on him. Abel Ferrara and Nicholas St. John had wanted to make King of New York since the early 1980s. Ferrara had shot test footage and begun casting calls as early as 1981, but shelved the project. Over the intervening 9 years, the script was heavily rewritten. Due to the film's controversial subject matter, Ferrara had difficulty finding an American studio willing to back the picture. The film was ultimately financed entirely by Italian companies Rete Italia and Scena International. Producer Augusto Caminito described the project as a bridge between Italian and American film industries, and likened the story to a modern-day Robin Hood. Principal photography began on April 19 and June 14, 1989. King of New York was shot entirely in and around New York City. According to Ferrara, then-owner Donald Trump gave him permission to film at the Plaza Hotel at no charge, on the condition that Walken would pose for a photograph with Ivana Trump, who was a fan of the actor. Filming locations included Sing Sing, the Plaza Hotel, Times Square, 42 ND Street Station, Williamsburg, Queensboro Bridge, 5th Avenue, Ossining, and Saranac Lake. Silvercup Studios served as the main studio. The film initially received an X rating from the MPAA, but was reduced to an R after an appeal. The film was scored by Ferrara's regular collaborator Joe Delia, and features 2 tracks by rapper Schoolly D. Am I Black Enough for You? And Saturday Night. On Rotten Tomatoes, the film has an approval rating of 74% based on 31 reviews, with an average rating of 6.4/10. The website's critics' consensus reads, King of New York covers familiar narrative ground with impressive style and leaves plenty of room for its talented cast to deliver gripping performances. On Metacritic, the Film has a weighted average score of 66 out of 100 based on 20 critics, indicating generally favorable reviews. Total film rated King of New York 4 stars out of 5. Roger Ebert awarded 2 stars out of 4, citing Walken's usual polished and somehow sinister ease and the director's strong command of mood and style, marred by a sketchy screenplay and a fragmented plot. Mark Caro, writing for the Chicago Tribune, gave the movie only 1 2-star, adding that star Christopher Walken and the movie remain just out of grasp. The film was featured in Stephen J. Schneider's 7th edition of 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die. Bohan Baseli was nominated for an Independent Spirit Award for Best Cinematography. The film has been noted for its influence on the hip-hop culture. Rapper The Notorious B.I.G. sometimes referred to himself as Frank White and the King of New York after the main character of this film. Similarly, Pop Smoke compared himself to Walken's character, including in his 2020 song Christopher Walken. R.A.S. Cass expressed admiration for the film. King of New York was released on a 2-disc special edition DVD on April 20, 2004. The film was released on Blu-ray on October 23, 2007. Arrow Video has released this film in 4K Ultra HD disc. Abel Ferrara is one of those anything goes kind of directors. He has a knack to show gritty urban scenes and not hold back the violence or any other sin or vice that goes along with that lifestyle. He's also really proficient at turning the black and whites of morality and turning them into one big gray area. A prime example would be his film from 1990, King of New York, a kind of Robin Hood tale if Robin Hood lived in New York City in the early 90s and was a figurehead in the criminal underworld. Frank White, Christopher Walken, is a very powerful and very wealthy player in the criminal underworld of New York City who has just gotten released from Sing Sing prison. Upon his return, he meets with an old associate, Jimmy Jump, Laurence Fishburne, and his gang to get back to business. This time, Frank believes he is reformed and begins robbing and killing criminals because he doesn't like how they do their business, with the prime goal of helping to fund the construction of a hospital. Some police officers, played by Victor Argo, David Caruso, and Wesley Snipes, don't like Frank's tactics and wage an illegal war against him since traditional legal methods have proven unsuccessful in bringing Frank down. King of New York is an entertaining movie, but definitely not perfect by any means. In fact, it's pretty far from perfect. What makes this movie memorable is its strong-headed style to show all of the drugs, violence, and sex that happen within the course of the story in graphic detail. A lot of filmmakers would opt to censor this, or at least tone it down, but Ferrara and his writer, Nicola St. John, are perfectly comfortable showing the brutality of these criminals. The main problem with this movie is that it doesn't really know what it wants to be. There are scenes where I felt like I really needed to take the content seriously, but the way it plays out seems like it exists mainly for pulp entertainment. The lighting, the set design, and even the characters all seem very over the top, but the themes of drug use and gang violence are all played as very serious things. This makes the movie very uneven. The film also moves at such a breakneck pace that I can't really fully understand and feel for the complex characters that make this film what it is. Everyone is very complex, and I really want to appreciate their characters, but I didn't feel like I had the time. Back to the positives, however, I dare someone to watch this film and not completely love Walken's performance. He has this way of really enveloping himself in his character to the point where you as the viewer are convinced that you are no longer watching Christopher Walken. Just look at The Deer Hunter. While I did complain about the contrast between the realism and the complete disregard for realism both in the same movie, I will say the over-the-top scenes are really entertaining. The gun battles and big car chase are really fun to watch, and the strange, almost Argento-ish, kind of lighting in some scenes is real eye candy. King of New York is completely uneven and an absolute mess when it comes to character development and a strong plot. What makes this movie interesting are the thematic content, brutality, and the performances by Walken and Fishburne. I can't see this movie being taken very seriously, but I would be so bold to put it in a cult classic category after doing some research on it. I'd definitely watch King of New York again, and I'd even go so far as to say it is an inspiration for some of the projects that I am working on. Few directors have had a run of films as impressive as Abel Ferrara managed in the 1990s. In total, he released 8 features during the decade, ranging from neo-noirs to experimental sci-fi to biographical dramas. His most enduring work of the period, and potentially of his entire career, is the one he made at the decade's start, King of New York, a gritty and moody crime drama focusing on a drug kingpin who, after his release from prison, seizes power from the reigning New York gangs and re-establishes his empire. The twist is that our titular king, Frank White, Christopher Walken, believes he can make amends for his blood-soaked past by using his drug money to fund development projects, such as the restoration of a hospital in one of the poorer areas of Manhattan. His sights are on the people and places left to rot by the city's politicians. One of King of New York's standout qualities is its absolutely electric cast: Laurence Fishburne, as White's chaotic and out-of-control right-hand man, Jimmy Jump, David Caruso and Wesley Snipes, playing 2 cops hell-bent on taking down White, even if it means going against the law they supposedly uphold, and Victor Argo, a regular of both Martin Scorsese and Ferrara's films, in a larger role than he usually gets, playing an older and more visibly exhausted police chief. The energy and vitality of each of these characters complements Walken's much more muted performance, which is full of mumbling and defined mostly by the image of his incredibly gaunt frame, punctuated by bursts of intense violence in only select moments. One scene that illustrates the ensemble's chemistry comes early, when White meets up with his gang for the first time after his release. There's a slow building tension, and it feels as if somebody is about to get shot, but that foreboding quickly fizzles when White's character suddenly bursts into a dance, and all share a commemorative hug. Given how expressionistic King of New York is, it's entirely fitting that, during a scene wherein someone attempts to facilitate a deal between White and a high-profile Chinatown gang, Murnau's Nosferatu plays in the background. The menacing vampire lumbering around jagged shadows seems to reflect Ferrara's film back at itself. Similarly, the decision to plunge the neon-lit cityscape into a kind of perpetual darkness creates a visual style akin to Jacques Tourneur's. New York feels as if it's been totally engulfed by the night, an effect as haunting as a trip to Dracula's castle or Frankenstein's lair. White stalks these gloomy streets, visiting his rivals and slowly picking them off, one by one, until he's regained ultimate control. However, despite the heavy shadows cast throughout the film, King of New York isn't devoid of color. Notably, Ferrara used swaths of deep blue to reflect the melancholia inching its way into these lives due to the tragedies that befall the film's characters. Then of course there's the red blood splatter, some truly beautiful squib work that ramps up the sense of action and brutality all the more when it butts up against the more muted overarching palette. And Ferrara's command of aesthetic design here extends further. Not only does King of New York look stunning, but it also has a beautifully orchestrated soundtrack, courtesy of longtime Ferrara collaborator Joe Delia, with the excellent School Lee song Am I Black Enough for You, playing just before the film's greatest, and most violent, shootout. All of this bravura style reinforces that King of New York is a film haunted by ruthlessness and affliction. Despite the characters' rough exteriors, it's clear that they have all been twisted by a system both social and economic that has led them down their respective paths. White believes he can do what believes by generating large sums of money to help the city's poorest, whereas Caruso's detective Gilly believes the only way to save the city is to eliminate White's gang entirely. Both go about their goals by bending the law around themselves without much regard for anything else, including themselves. White's desire to reform his actions establishes an interesting dichotomy between this film and Abel's immediate follow-up, Bad Lieutenant, which instead of focusing on salvation through pure economics, guides its tortured central character, who happens to be a corrupt police officer, down a path of spiritual enlightenment. Both characters slide easily into Abel's aura of damaged men, stuck in perpetual cycles of violence, attempting to absolve themselves of former sins. King of New York is perhaps one of Ferrara's most straightforward narrative films, accounting for its status as at least a cult classic, but it's still thoroughly identifiable as a work of the auteur, losing very little of the audacious thematic tilts, low-budget aesthetics, and grungy energy that marks the director's unique cinematic language. Whilst the examination of class warfare and rampant corruption might be executed in a fairly rudimentary way relative to the puzzling density of the director's later films, its themes of persisting guilt, the possibility of transcendence, and murky living under late-stage capitalism remain poignant. There's plenty of divergence even among Ferrara enthusiasts as to which film exactly his masterpiece may be, but there's no doubt that King of New York affords viewers an excellent entry point into the raw, gritty, and often bizarre filmography of one of American cinema's most underrated and singular visionaries. Abel Ferrara's King of New York, a gritty action movie about a New York drug kingpin, was a surprise entry in this year's Telluride Film Festival, where tastes are usually loftier. Maybe the selection was intended to honor Ferrara as a stylist whose movies may look commercial but feel as if the soul of an artist is stirring somewhere inside them. That was the case with his episodes for TV's Crime Story and for his film China Girl, the 1987 thriller that trapped two lovers, a Chinese-American girl and an Italian-American boy, in the battlefield between opposing gangs in New York's Little Italy and Chinatown. The movie was Romeo and Juliet recycled through West Side Story and the TV action series of your choice, but the look was something else, a garish, neon-lit film noir universe of warm lips, sleek hair, and desperate eyes. Now comes King of New York, Ferrara's most expensive and ambitious picture to date, with borrowings from a different classic. Instead of Romeo and Juliet, this one recycles Robin Hood, with Christopher Walken as a New York drug kingpin who wants to use his profits to pay the budget of a hospital for poor people. The Walken character never quite gets around to explaining precisely how he plans to set up his financing, and I am not sure any money actually goes to the poor and sick, but it's a good idea, anyway. Walken glides through the movie with his usual polished and somehow sinister ease, a man supremely confident of his ability to succeed in an arena where most people end up dead. Part of his genius is to control a large gang of black drug dealers, whose fealty to him is hard to explain, although perhaps they enjoy attending business meetings in his suite at the Plaza Hotel. Eventually the empire breaks up, however, in double crossings and reprisals, broken loyalties, and stool pigeons, although it will take a viewer more clever than myself to explain exactly what happens in the fragmented labyrinth of the movie's plot. All of Ferrara's movies make a point of interracial friendships and romance, and Walken has at least 2 black girlfriends among his other sidekicks. I do not write at least because I cannot remember the exact number, but because the relationships in this movie are so sketchy that it's hard to be sure. Is there a point to be made here? No. Ferrara gives us a white leader of a black gang of drug dealers and scarcely seems to notice it. The movie is much stronger in its particulars than in its overall drift. There are a couple of genuinely effective scenes, including one where the Walken character is accosted by muggers on the subway, shows them his gun, frightens them, then pulls out money and throws it to them, promising there's more where that came from and that they should simply ask for me at the plaza. The lack of a scene showing the muggers inquiring after Walken at the plaza's front desk is one of the movie's more regrettable lapses. I am not sure that Walken is always sure exactly why his character behaves as he does. The screenplay has a cavalier way with details, but he has a way of slinking through the plot that's convincing. Walken is one of the few undeniably charismatic male villains of recent years. He can generate a snake-like charm that makes his worst characters the most memorable, and here he operates on pure style. No gaps in the film's logic, no inconsistencies in the plot, not even a decidedly peculiar ending can discourage him. He's somehow able to convince us that he knows why everything is happening, even if most of the other characters, and the filmmakers, seem bewildered. What Ferrara needs for his next film is a sound screenplay. He has gone about as far as a director can go on pure style, and he apparently isn't one of those filmmakers who can begin with a sketchy script and patch it up as he goes along. His effects are too good, his command of mood is too sure, for him to continue trying to bluff his way through half-written movies like this one. All it did was whet my appetite. If you're looking for a one-person definition of the outsider filmmaker, then Abel Ferrara should definitely be high up on the short list. A resolutely independent director, his films don't so much push the conventions of his various genres in which he works as grab them by the scruff of the neck, throw them against the wall and piss on them. These are sometimes dark and even dangerous movies, films that are guaranteed to annoy and occasionally offend those who prefer their characters likable and their stories told in a clean and tidy manner. His 1996 The Funeral stripped the Italian gangster movie of its Godfather glamour. The Addiction, 1995, linked vampirism to urban decay and genocide, and The Superb Bad Lieutenant, 1992, took the concept of the corrupt city cop to an deeply disturbing but unforgettable extreme. King of New York is an urban gangland thriller whose central character is possibly the most iconic in all of Ferrara's cinema. The director apparently conceived the role of Frank White. The script was actually written by long-term Ferrara collaborator Nicola St. John, specifically with Christopher Walken in mind, an actor who at this point he had never met, and had Walken not taken the role then the film would not have been made. It's easy to see why. Walken is at the peak of his game here, a walking beacon of criminal cool and restrained malevolence, whose every word is laced with danger and whose sudden explosions of fury can be startling. The film opens with Frank being released from jail, and he wastes no time in hooking up with old partner Jimmy Jump, a hugely enjoyable, larger-than-life performance from Larry Fishburne. His reunion with Frank is priceless, and re-establishing the sort of underworld power base that presumably landed him in the pokey in the first place. Flanked by a beautiful female entourage that includes glamorous Park Avenue attorney Jennifer, and protected by a unit of hedonistic, trigger-happy warriors, he is the essence of the amoral modern capitalist, for whom the continual accumulation of wealth by any means is an end in itself, and if that means wiping out a rival gang to take their drugs or their business, then so be it. That he appears to have a social conscience regarding the poor of his own community can't help but come across as self-serving and ultimately hypocritical, given that a fair proportion of those who will make use of the hospital he is so keen to keep open will do so as the result of the drugs he is getting rich on or the violence that goes hand in hand with their distribution. Although much of this may seem familiar now, back in 1990 Ferrara was treading on new and sometimes uncomfortable ground. The film's upfront depiction of both the glamour and the extreme violence that comes with big-time drug racketeering, and its posing and image-conscious black gangstas were an opening cannonade in a subgenre that was soon to find a sizable audience with the success of films like New Jack City, 1991, and Menace to Society, 1993. This is not violence dressed up in codes of honor or family loyalties, but brutal and messy, as much as a statement of power as it is tactical or defensive. Gun battles can erupt in the middle of a drug deal or out in the street. At one point gunshots are used as sentence punctuation after Frank has executed a rival gang leader, shooting bullets into the body to emphasize his open arms offer to the survivors to join him. Frank's strength is that he ignores social and racial barriers and will recruit anyone he thinks might be useful to his operation, from experienced Italian mobsters to lowly street punks. His weakness is that he starts to believe his own press and becomes convinced that he really can go up against anyone and come through unscathed, whether it be gangland rivals or the establishment and its representatives. Although Walken's considerable charm and screen presence assures that audience allegiance is with Frank from the off, the film deviates from the norm by intermittently and unexpectedly switching our sympathies to the opposing side, represented by hot-headed detective Skilly and Flanagan and the more seasoned and level-headed Bishop. Initially they come across as three musketeers of self-righteous vengeance, cops with an attitude and a serious grudge against our boy, but as the story progresses and we are offered a glimpse of the off-duty men behind the badges and bear witness to the violent chaos that results from Frank's activities, you start to realize that they may have a point. These are not men hell-bent on personal vengeance, but cops outraged by a criminal who scorns everything they stand for, whose power is so great that he has become almost untouchable, at least through legal channels. This audience-police bond, though disconcertingly uneven, is formed so effectively through the savvy casting of established character actor Victor Argo as Bishop and stars to be David Caruso and Wesley Snipes as Gilly and Flanagan, now familiar faces that retrospectively provide an accelerated route to character connection. When we're with the detectives, it's clear that Frank is indeed dangerous monster, but he's our dangerous monster and a charismatic one at that, and despite our sympathy with the detectives' collective frustration, it's a tough loyalty to break. King of New York may not be Ferrara's most extreme film or seem like his most rule-breaking, but this is partly due to the overshadowing effect of some of the more financially successful and widely seen genre films that followed in its wake. New Jack City was the highest-grossing independent feature film of 1991, making 5 times its budget on home turf cinema tickets alone. But it's a still seriously kick-ass crime movie, stylishly shot, and explosively performed by a cult cast to die for. It's even got Steve Buscemi as the only white guy on Jimmy Jump's crew, and as fresh and enjoyably edgy as any film in the director's over. I read somewhere online that the members of NWA used to watch King of New York over and over again when it first came out, so I decided I had to see it. That endorsement definitely let me know I was in for something special, or at least interesting. I am also a big fan of Abel Ferrara's notorious NC-17 film Bad Lieutenant, which he directed right after King of New York. King of New York opens with gangster Frank White, Christopher Walken, being released from prison. He exits through the prison gates, gets in his chauffeured limousine and promptly enters his fortress-like compound through his own security gate that is as imposing as any at the correctional facility. Might this mean that Frank is symbolically trapped in his own prison? King of New York doesn't offer much by way of plot. Basically, Frank tries to reclaim his throne as King of New York's mob drug trafficking scene. To do this, he has to fend off highly armed competing drug lords and evade the police, who will use any means necessary to stop him. It's tough being the king. That's really it. Will Frank make it out of this gauntlet alive? In a way, it reminded me of a video game. Or a western. What King of New York does have is a heaping abundance of style. Christopher Walken has great hair in this film, perhaps the best hair of his career. It is a magnificent mountain of hair. It may have been a wig. It made me think of Gary Oldman's stunning do in Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992. The inside of Frank's compound also looks like it could be Dracula's lair, with long, thin candles on candelabras. King of New York features more black hats than a Bob Fosse musical. Seemingly everyone in the film sports a black bowler or pork pie hat at some point in the movie. Several set UPS have dramatic blue lighting for no apparent reason other than to look cool and theatrical. The film also features a catalog's worth of awesome sunglasses. Overall, it's as if director Ferrara got his production designer and costume designer together and said, "Go nuts." The style of this film has a life of its own. This film has about as much psychological depth as Grand Theft Auto 4. We never get to truly know Frank White, or any of the other characters. If anything, Frank seems to disappear amid the hubbub around him. He's the proverbial calm inside the hurricane, but Walken's slackness doesn't make for dramatic viewing. Women have little place in this movie. Frank has 2 blondes in his life, one who gives him pleasure, Melanie, played by Swedish model Kari Nygren, and one who stimulates his mind, his lawyer Jennifer, played by Janet Julian. Outside of one Asian woman in a black cocktail dress who runs around spraying bullets with an Uzi, no women have much of an impact on the plot of this movie. Wesley Snipes and David Caruso both hang out in this film's universe as cops. Steve Buscemi shows up as a drug dealer and career-heavy Victor Argo puts in a compelling turn as an unflashy old cop who is determined to hunt Frank down. Laurence Fishburne, however, deserves special praise in his role as Jimmy Jump, the leader of the black crew that is allied with Frank's mob. Fishburne makes his one-dimensional character come alive. This is a good, fun movie, but Fishburne's acting transcends this movie. He is electric. Jimmy is a jerk, but he's a charismatic jerk in a black backwards Kangol hat and Mr. T-style gold chains, with a ridiculous strut. Jimmy can't just enter a room, he has to own the room the moment he enters it. This is best shown in the scene where Jimmy orders fried chicken and ribs from a humble, hole-in-the-wall barbecue place. He can't just order his food. He has to dominate the guy working at the counter and humiliate him in front of everyone who's watching. He's like the villain in a western who enters a saloon, orders a whiskey from the bartender and then throws it in his face. You can see why Frank fears him. This is the best scene in the film. It feels like a scene from a better film, and it made me wish that King of New York centered on Fishburne's Jimmy Jump, not Frank White. Laurence Fishburne is the best thing about King of New York, and he is great in it. King of New York was very entertaining and I loved the over-the-top style tucked in its corners. You could easily watch this movie as a comedy. It is the funniest serious gangster film I have ever seen. It does not deserve a place on the all-time list of gangster films, but its style makes it significant. Among the gangster films of its own era, it is better than New Jack City, 1991, but of course pales next to Goodfellas, 1990. King of New York is essentially an exploitation movie trading in sex and violence but takes itself too seriously to share in the tongue-in-cheek qualities of grindhouse fare. And as an exercise in style, which is its principal calling card, as that style is of the late 1980s, it is laughably dated with its blinged-up designer punks, softcore sex, nose powder chic, and cartoon violence. It does have one merit and that is Christopher Walken's uber-cool drug boss, but as good as Walken is one can't help but feel embarrassed for him, and that goes for other cast members such as Laurence Fishburne, Wesley Snipes, Giancarlo Esposito, and Steve Buscemi, all of whom have seen much better days. King of New York is Scarface, 1983, for MTV Generation. Ferrara directed a number of episodes of the classic 80s schlock TV series, Miami Vice, with Walken playing Frank White, a New York career crim who gets out of the slammer having decided to become a crime kingpin. This is not unusual for the territory, but what is that realizing that he has wasted his life, he wants to do good in his community. The project he picks is a South Bronx hospital that needs $16 million to stay operational. So Frank, validated in his own mind by the righteousness of his mission, starts wiping out everyone who stands in his cash-generating way. None of this has even a remote grounding in reality, with Ferrara more concerned with topping the vicarious thrills of genre precedents than creating anything dramatically credible. This applies particularly to the subplot involving the cops who are inexplicably prepared to die to stop him, even when Frank points out to their boss, Victor Argo, that he, Frank, is only wasting scumbags. Ferrara wants us to see this as irony, but the problem is not so much that Frank White is not Michael Corleone but that Ferrara is no Coppola. As the saying goes, when you sleep with dogs, you wake up with fleas. When you look at the history of cinema, there are often films that are released around the same time that never quite get a look in or reach the same status as the so-called classics. These films are often just as good, if not better, than their more successful brethren, but don't get the same exposure and usually get branded cult, which is a word that gets used far too often and often loses much of its meaning. However, driller-killer director Abel Ferrara's 1990 film King of New York certainly fits the bill as a cult movie, and one that blows away many similarly themed and more successful crime movies from the time. Crime lord Frank White, Christopher Walken, The Dead Zone, has just been released from prison and returns to his old haunts to start strong-arming the other gangsters who have moved in on his territory. Looking to add a little legitimacy to his image, Frank decides he wants to become mayor of New York and sets about wiping out his criminal competition in a bid to clean up the streets, have total control of all operations and distribute his wealth to the needy and poorer parts of the city. Catching the attention of the authorities, Frank becomes the prime target for a group of strung-out cops determined to put him and his rapidly expanding gang of enforcers away, but the lack of evidence means they may have to turn to more unorthodox methods to achieve their aim. A slightly twisted take on the Robin Hood theme, King of New York has enough clout and star power to have been a sizable hit upon release, but unfortunately it was released on the same day, not just week or month but day, as Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas, which is pretty big competition if you're going to release a gangster movie. No matter, though, as King of New York has a flavor all of its own which eschews the polished glamorizing of Scorsese's mobsters in favor of Ferrara's trademark grittiness. Undoubtedly the star of the show, Christopher Walken oozes dark menace in a way that none of his on-screen personas before this had done. There is a scene where Frank White is sat in a cinema with Triad leader Larry Wong, Joey Chin, watching F.W. Murnau's 1922 classic Nosferatu, and Walken's own performance can be likened to that of the vampire, cold and soulless, yet calculating with a simmering rage that threatens to boil over at any given moment. His movements throughout the film are also comparable to those of a monster movie villain, swiftly observing the carnage around him before making his next crucial strike. But there are many other notable performances in this film. Laurence Fishburne, The Matrix, is excellent as White's main enforcer Jimmy Jump, who lacks the fatal charisma of his boss but has more than enough moves of his own to make him an uncontrollable force. Steve Buscemi, Reservoir Dogs, also makes an early appearance as the drug-dealing test tube, no need for an explanation there, another integral part of Frank's gang. Frank's adversaries are also an intriguing lot, as the law seems powerless to convict Frank so they take matters into their own hands. Wesley Snipes, Blade, plays Flanagan, who seems to have a bit of a rivalry with Jump, but it is David Caruso, First Blood, as the reckless Dennis Gilly who provides most of the best moments in his confrontations with Frank and his hoodlums. He is also the main focus of one of the film's most shocking moments. This 4K version of the film is simply stunning to look at, with the rich colors that Abel Ferrara washes his shots with contrasting perfectly with the deep blacks of the city streets, making New York as much of a character as Frank White. The famous car chase in the rain looks absolutely stunning, and the film's climax, set in the neon-lit city streets, is as colorful and striking as it is mean and uncompromising. Thankfully, the audio problems that plagued the previous Arrow Blu-ray release from a few years ago has been corrected with a remixed 5.1 surround soundtrack that is as crystal clear as the picture, the numerous gunshots punching through the dialogue to great effect, and the extras have been ported over from the previous release, which include 2 audio commentaries, a few archive crew interviews and a couple of interesting featurettes about Abel Ferrara and his works. King of New York is an underrated gem that got a bit buried upon its original release. It hasn't dated as badly as a lot of the crime/action thrillers of the late 80s/early 90s, in fact, it looks pretty damn good considering what the fashions were like at the time, and even the pumping hip-hop soundtrack doesn't seem too incongruous when compared to some of today's standards. Christopher Walken gives what is likely his best performance here and is probably his last proper performance before he started to become a bit of a parody of himself, and the supporting cast are all great, creating some memorable characters, which is something that a lot of gangster movies don't always do all that well. The film looks fantastic, is totally engaging throughout and has some really well staged scenes that will stick in your mind after the film has finished, and even if you already own it on standard Blu-ray, the 4K UHD upgrade is still worth putting your hands in your pocket for, as the lush visuals and improved audio make it feel like you're watching it for the first time again. Overall, a flawless version of a standout of 90s cinema as it should be seen. The opening moments are very solid. Just the presence Walken gives, that his is a man with a lot going on within him, yet strong-willed enough to keep himself composed. He has gained and earned the respect of those close to him, including these 2 hot chicks who would probably sleep with him any time he asked, yet they also wouldn't have a problem finding someone else for him to sleep with, let alone the fact that they would actually put their lives on the line for him. Why? Because he is a badass, a gentleman when he needs to be, ruthless when he feels it's necessary, actually has good intentions with his plans for the city, and cares about the people who follow him. But he's also a man who has lived a criminal life for too long to live anyway else. On the other hand, he also lived that life long enough to see how fucked up both that way of life is, and how fucked up the straight path is. He has witnessed corruption in both the criminal world, the civilian world, the law enforcement world, the political world, and with the justice system trying to keep things together. He's lived in the world, and in prison, long enough to know which things are pipe dreams and which are more realistically achievable. Which is why I think this film had a huge pair of balls on it at the time of its release, when the war on drugs was in full swing. Walken's character simply looks at the drug trade as a necessary evil when it comes to business and coming out on top, nothing more. Just as he sees the hiring of thugs off the street to be a necessary evil, which also has its upsides to it. Sure, these are the same type of people who would sniff/shoot the same drugs they would sell on the street, somewhat victims of society and the system, though going outside the box, I believe that to be a lesser extent compared to the other reasons, made bad choices in life setting them on the gangster path. But hiring them gives them opportunities, is more cost-effective than hiring bodyguards, and involves them in a, somewhat, constructive business. And Walken's business us utilizing the criminal world for some good, such as using drug money to keep a hospital from shutting down, a hospital that helps children stay alive. Granted, this could be a two-edged sword, with these same children later growing up into the same type of gangsters, thugs, straight or crooked cops/politicians, etc., all thanks to this drug business. But it's making the best out of a bad situation that could be worse. I was worried for a bit, with how some of these cops decided to relentlessly pursue Walken, both in and outside the boundaries of the law. Worried that this film would go with the theme of becoming the very monster you're fighting. Thankfully, the film is as smart as I was hoping it would be. Near the finale, Walken confronts the leader of the force that had been after him, and tells him what's what. Walken felt the justice system wasn't effective enough to put things right, so he chose the criminal life to get things done faster. Likewise, main members of the police felt the justice system wasn't effective enough to put things right, so they decided to stop doing things by the law to try and put lawbreakers away. And regardless of what either side does, the drug business, the criminal business, will thrive. The best they can hope for is to have some sense of order to it, some sense of honor. Figuring out where their priorities lie. That all being said, this film isn't perfect. It's a bit rough around the edges at times. I thought Walken's character could have shown a little more depth, via the script. And there's some characters we're left wondering what happened with, plus some dangling plot threads. Janet Julian's character, the lawyer being asked to try and rein Walken in, though that scene is the last we ever see of him. It's still a solid watch. Filmmaker Abel Ferrara is possibly best known for his controversial slasher/horror The Driller Killer. The 1979 film concerns a struggling artist who would take his stresses out on the local derelicts of New York City using his power drill. It provided a few shocking moments, and along with its graphic artwork ensured The Driller Killer ended up on the notorious video nasties list in the UK in 1984. The Driller Killer wasn't released uncut and approved by the BBFC until 2002. That being said, The Driller Killer wasn't quite as bad as Mary Whitehouse and the Fun Police might have had you believe in the 80s. Sure, it did have its shocking moments of gore, and a gritty, grimy feel, and its original cover, depicting a man being drilled in the head, did it no favors in terms of its outright ban on initial release. But the film also showed a sort of arty, neo-noir side to Abel Ferrara's work that would have got lost amongst all the controversy. It was pretty clear that Ferrara had a vision all of his own. It was just going to be a struggle to get that vision out to the masses. Fast forward to 1990 and the release of crime drama/thriller, King of New York. The film appeared to tick the Ferrara boxes in terms of a gritty feel and moments of shocking violence, but the story about a man fresh out of prison trying to make a go of things, along with a pretty generic cover including its main star, Christopher Walken, looking out at what you imagine are the mean streets of New York, seemed to avoid any negative attention. In fact, the reception to King of New York was generally a positive one and the film has gained cult status, which is why Arrow Video has given King of New York a brand new 4K restoration for fans to rediscover, and newcomers to, hopefully, fall in love with. King of New York concerns Frank White, Christopher Walken, a former drug lord and kingpin in New York City, released from prison and wanting to start a new life of using and sharing his profits to help the poor. But it's not that easy, and Frank's shady past and involvement with dodgy characters, career criminals, gangsters, and the police inevitably catches up with him. Firstly, Walken gives a brilliant performance here. The actor, who had already impressed in 1978's The Deer Hunter and 1983's Stephen King adaptation, The Dead Zone, showed an ease for calm menace in King of New York as the mob boss like Frank White, which is quite unnerving at times. The character of Frank White is certainly an interesting one. Almost some sort of anti-hero, as he clearly wants to use his notoriety to help the poor, but he also isn't afraid to take care of those who disagree with his plans and methods. Frank also has a quirky side to his personality, as he does a little celebratory dance on his first meet-up since his release in front of a gang of criminal associates led by Laurence, then Larry, Fishburne's character, Jimmy Jump. It makes you wonder if any other actor could have pulled off this role, 1 minute coming across as a charming businessman, then into a random dance, and then into calm and quiet menace. It's very impressive. It also brings to mind musician and DJ Fatboy Slim's 2000 hit, Weapon of Choice, the video of which starred Walken memorably dancing around a large hotel to said song. It's definitely worth tracking down if you haven't seen it. Walken and Laurence Fishburne aside, King of New York also stars David Caruso, CSI, Miami, Session 9, First Blood, Steve Buscemi, Reservoir Dogs, Fargo, Boardwalk Empire, and Wesley Snipes, Blade, Demolition Man, White Men Can't Jump, in roles that may not have been major but are enough to deliver solid performances. Particularly Caruso's burnt-out and angry cop, Dennis Gilly, whose revenge for the brutal slaying of his partner is in itself quite brutal. The violence in King of New York is actually quite in your face and brutal, which fits in with Abel Ferrara's previous reputation. There are no power drills to the head this time, but there is plenty of gunplay, and it is in your face and matter of fact, but at the same time not exploitative, just gritty, brutal realism, which adds to the overall feel of the film. Extras for this release of King of New York include audio commentaries by Abel Ferrara, composer Joe Delia, producer Mary Kane, casting director Randy Sabusawa, and editor Anthony Redman, an interview with Abel Ferrara, an interview with producer Augusto Caminito, Abel Ferrara, Not Guilty, a documentary on the director, a documentary looking back on Ferrara's career titled A Short Film about the long career of Abel Ferrara, original theatrical trailers and TV spots, image gallery, and a reversible sleeve featuring new artwork. First pressings also include an illustrated collector's booklet containing essays on the film. Overall, King of New York is a gripping tale of crime and one man's flawed, violent mission to do the right thing against the odds. A powerful, at times exciting, at times brutal, and yes, sometimes it's a victim of its time, but nonetheless, King of New York is still a worthwhile watch. King of New York is incredibly slick and has a well-polished sheen to it. Christopher Walken is the very definition of cool in his portrayal of Frank White, while Laurence Fishburne is deliciously craven as Jimmy Jump. But, all the fancy glitter, colorful lights, and a couple of good performances can't make up for a complete lack of direction. I sense that Abel Ferrara wants to use Frank White to say something about the lines blurring between good and evil, or about how evil men will do what evil men will do. However, while I am able to sense what Ferrara is going for, that doesn't mean it ever comes across in the movie in any clear fashion. King of New York spends too much time asking too many of the wrong questions and making the viewer think about immaterial matters not central to the theme, the plot, or the characters. Cool was how I described Walken as Frank White, and that is about the best definition that character could hope to receive. Walken is endlessly cool as White, whether it is from his far-off glances, his devil-may-care attitude towards all situations, or his interesting body mannerisms. Laurence Fishburne is the exact opposite as Jimmy Jack. He's not cool, he is out of control. It's an out of control we don't mind necessarily, but it's still an out of control we recognize will come to a bad end. Both actors inhabit their characters wholly and their performances are great because of their willingness to transform themselves into Frank White and Jimmy Jack. King of New York could have done a lot with their characters, but it falters and you end up with two dynamic characters inhabiting a world that doesn't make sense. It certainly doesn't help that every other character in the film seems like a 2-bit knockoff of some other character from some other movie or a vapid caricature. Walken and Fishburne stand out from the rest, but despite their best efforts they aren't able to elevate the material on hand to another level. There's a lot to like about King of New York, the aforementioned Walken and Fishburne performances, and the visual style of the film is definitely a strength of the film. King of New York is all harsh grays and blacks mixed with neon brightness. It is a very interesting and unique neo-noir style. But, that is King of New York's biggest problem, it is all style and no substance. The themes are never clearly defined, the plot never feels like it matters and it never gels into an actual story. King of New York feels like half of a picture, and half of a picture just isn't good enough. I will not try to count the times I have seen this movie, and while it lacks some elements to make it a classic, the appeal of this one is still great. Christopher Walken was superb in the role of Frank White and he was able to pull off all the film needed from his character. He was a great anti-hero and despite his unsavory actions, Walken still made the character very likable. The script was clearly on the simple side, the characters were lacking much depth, but this is where I feel Walken made the most of his material. With his demeanor, and dead eyes you can sense much about him. Walken portrays a man who has spent years on the streets and weathered the storm, while his years in prison definitely changed his outlook on his mortality. This script doesn't tell you how long he was in prison, but you get the sense it was a long time. Once back out on the streets you get a sense of urgency about his character. It was very interesting to see this aspect of his character progress through the film. The cinematography by Bohan Bazeli was excellent, and working with director Abel Ferrara, the two created a very visually appealing film in a subtle way. It was hip, fresh and gritty all at the same time. Added with the soundtrack and score put together by Joe Delia, this is a complete package for the genre, and in my mind ahead of its time with its raw tone. There was a great mix of rap and hip-hop to lock in the era and a mix of soft orchestral tones to create an odd, but effective blend. As the music changes between the characters and Frank White goes about some of his silent scenes, the soft music that plays over the scenes gives his character an elegance among his dirty criminal actions. Criminal activity is clearly glorified to an extent, but it still works to give the entire story a somewhat rebellious feel. For the time period this film was released it holds some plausible weight, and the direction of the script, for me, did an excellent job of depicting the leverage the crime trade had on the neighborhoods during the rampant influx of drugs in the 80s. Through the characters playing the cops in this film you can feel the hopelessness in their attempts to try and bring these crime syndicates to justice. I will admit that with some deeper creation to the storyline this could have been conveyed much better with a greater impact. Also, for as entertaining as this film was, the story was rather generic and really held a monotone pace before its third act wrap-up. Without the strong cast of familiar faces in their younger years, and many bringing great performances, this would not have been the appealing crime drama it is. Wesley Snipes, David Caruso, and Laurence Fishburne, back when he still went by Larry, were all great. In particular from Fishburne, who brought the film another brand of eccentricity through his character. It could be argued that his performance was a fine line between overacting and portraying pure craziness. Either way it worked for his role, and for me he clearly came across as an insane leader under Frank White, almost as if he was White's living alter ego. Caruso was a fun comic relief at times, and he delivered some intensity through his anger as a cop, feeling as if he is fighting a battle that cannot be won. The only problem was the angle was thinly written, and unfortunately some of his lines come across as forced. Snipes had some moments as well, but without much screen time he was little more than a strong side character. No good crime drama would be complete without some violence, and King of New York gives you plenty. There was a Chinatown shootout that I will admit was a little weak, but other than that scene the rest of the violent sequences were very tense. The action in this film was well shot and placed in gritty locations of the city to pull you into the setting, which enables a great amount of intensity to come off through them. In the end, King of New York has its flaws, but it doesn't hinder the enjoyment. The performance of Walken was excellent, and seeing the cast when they were younger is a nice addition to a film that no matter when you watch it will pull you back to the early 90s. This film is not to the level of, say, The Departed, but for what it was during its time, it was then, and is still to this day, a great gangster movie. Something of a retro classic, Abel Ferrara's King of New York was a genre game-changer way back in 1990, maybe critics were slow to latch on, but in a sense, it's an apex of gangster noir cinema. It's also a great example of New York being portrayed as an absolute reeking radioactive hellscape from which absolutely nobody walks away in one piece. Efforts to clean up the city made films like this immediately dated, since Ferrara and writer Nicola St. John wanted to make King of New York for 10 years, but bankrolled the likes of Fear City instead. Recalling classic Warner Brothers films from the 30s like G-Men or The Roaring Twenties, this is a slick, sick gangster epic, 90 minutes of gunfire, death, and hardened dudes wiping the floor with each other's bloody corpses. In a career festooned with memorable performances, the role of ex-con gangster might just be Christopher Walken's best. His hollow-eyed, thin-smiling, smooth-dancing kingpin Frank White is first glimpsed getting out of the slammer and getting a limo to take him to a secure location. He's a wild and dangerous animal transported from one cage to another. White's reappearance on the urban scene, back from the dead, precedes a tidal wave of reprisal killing, a telephone box slaying, executions at funerals, cops smashed into fire hydrants while hanging onto the doors of speeding cars, the bodies of White's enemies left hanging upside down from ceilings. It's all White's work, but his face is generally impassive, watching from the window of his limo, sometimes illuminated by the blast of his sawn-off. In 1990, you didn't get far in NYC without crime credentials, and Frank White uses his to the max. He's building a children's hospital, and even turns up at Broadway shows and galas, where he doesn't flinch or move a muscle as fake gunplay unfolds on stage. White sets up shop in plain sight at the Plaza Hotel, and Ferrara's film is small enough to squeeze a crew into real locations in Silvercup, Times Square, and Sing Sing. Gangsters watch private shows in cinemas of movies like Nosferatu, I Got Frankenstein Coming Next, while their malls give each other blowback to some banging school lead tracks. If you came for Walken, astride a limo with his torso sticking out of the sunroof, an Uzi in each hand, you'll stay for the impressive cornicing glimpsed in the background. This is authentic NYC to the maximum. This country spends $100 billion a year on drugs, and it's not because of me, White concludes, giving a free rein to justifying his own behavior and styling himself as an opportunist making the best of market conditions he didn't create. The supporting cast also rock, with Giancarlo Esposito, Victor Argo, David Caruso, and Wesley Snipes amongst the dour, dedicated cops giving their lives to bring White down. Laurence Fishburne also makes an impression as a trigger-happy dealer who brings a suitcase to a drug deal. The unfortunate who opens it discovers nothing but 100 tampons, which he urgently needs to fill the gaps as Fishburne abruptly fills him full of lead. New York crime didn't disappear, it just moved into less public surroundings. King of New York's grim fantasy clicks because it reflects a time when the battle between law and disorder was taken directly to the streets, with Walken best riding the bloodshed like a colossus. Respect for Abel Ferrara's intelligent, kinetic cult classic 1990 gangster picture King of New York has been a very long time coming. Upon its original cinematic release, the critical reaction was mostly negative for Ferrara's crime saga. A meretricious bit of sleaze, incompetently put together, wrote the late Alexander Walker in the Evening Standard, while Christopher Tukey in the Sunday Telegraph dismissed it as yet another foul-mouthed, ultra-violent thriller about a gangster wasting his rivals. Others loved the picture. Gavin Smith in Film Comment was fulsome in his praise, a stylishly executed gangster movie that harnesses the up-for-grabs energies of New York's multicultural streets with classical poise and state-of-the-art genre filmmaking. The legendary New York rapper Biggie Smalls, aka the Notorious B.I.G., would watch King of New York continually on video, refer to it in his raps and always use the nom de guerre Frank White, the name of the central mobster character in the movie, when checking into hotels. During 2002, Ian Sinclair, the eminent London essayist, poet, and author of the superb books Lights Out for the Territory and Hackney, That Rose-Red Empire, completely bucked the general critical trend. In Sight and Sound, Sinclair wrote an exceptional, lengthy essay, entitled Welcome to the Circle. Bang Bang, in which he seriously and articulately argued that The King of New York was a reasonable contender for a inclusion in an all-time top 10 films list. In the past 10 years, the critical kudos for King of New York, and the sorely missed Ferrara, films completed, never given UK releases, has only continued to rise, in a similar fashion to the film that so often eclipses it, De Palma's 1983 epic remake of Scarface, which also initially received savage reviews. Insistently blending extreme artifice, harsh reality, and juxtaposing cultural opposites, the brooding classical music of Vivaldi and the equally timeless punchy hip-hop of Schoolly D, the upscale restaurants of the ruling class elite and the glimpses of dog-eat-dog underclass street life, Ferrara and his gifted script writer Nicola St. John transpose the 30s Warner Brothers gangster films of James Cagney, The Roaring Twenties, and Edward G. Robertson, Little Caesar, to the violent late 1980s/ early 1990s streets of the ultimate city of the 20th century. Sporting a bizarre blow-dry haircut, Christopher Walken is at his most utterly alien. He could be the gangster who fell to earth, as the very unlikely hero/villain, drug kingpin, Frank White. The plot is simple, essentially the tradition rise and inevitable fall of an American gangster, with a few startling innovations. Just out after a long stretch in prison, White, looking like he has been revived from a slab in a morgue, an anemic mobster vampire, has his implausibly mixed-race black-clad gang headed by crazed, 2-45 automatic pistol-toting, leather-clad, clockwork orange bowler hat-sporting Jimmy Jump, Larry Fishburne, in a star-making performance, delineates a character who is either created by hip-hop/gangsta rap music or is the living embodiment of the type of character who inspired it, rebuild his empire by wiping out the similarly black-clad Colombian, Italian, and Chinese competition. Like the real-life mobster John Gotti, St. John incorporated elements of actual transcripts of FBI wiretaps of conversations Gotti had with his familiars, specifically Frank's "Give me one more year" speech. White becomes a media star, aspiring to use his dead rival's drug millions in a doomed attempt to rebuild a community hospital in Harlem. Frank White is so deluded that he truly believes that he should not be the quarry of his most tenacious opponent, dedicated veteran detective Roy Bishop, the marvelous Victor Argo, one of Scorsese's favorite actors, and his hot-headed young Irish cops, David Caruso and Wesley Snipes, also making their breakout feature film debuts. But the mayor of New York, "I'm not your problem. I'm just a businessman," he informs Bishop. Ironically, in a film filled with spectacular gunfights, a shootout in a suite within a Travelodge International hotel, a street in the heart of Chinatown, a hole-in-the-wall club, and from the roof a speeding limousine, White goes out quietly slumped in the back of a New York cab in heavy traffic in a pre-Disney sanitized Times Square, bleeding from a single shot to the stomach. King of New York is a highly stylized modern masterpiece of, relatively, low-budget intemperance, profanity, and violence, with dazzling cinematography by Bohan Bazelli and vivid production design by Alex Tavolaris. Ian Sinclair has rightly praised the beautiful melancholy fatalism of the opening of the picture, with Frank White's long limo journey from jail, actually shot on location at Sing Sing Maximum Security Prison, to Manhattan, that invokes that earlier cinema, the masters honored in the Aeolian best lists, Bresson, Jean-Pierre Melville. Incisively written by Ferrara's longtime collaborator Nicola St. John, with a great ensemble cast, with an early appearance by current Boardwalk Empire star Steve Buscemi as ashen cocaine tester tubes, King of New York can be viewed as a metaphorical piece charting the small accomplishments and hard fall of the post-1968 multicultural counterculture/left-field filmmaking, a meditation upon the ultimate futility of eoth war against drugs, or a prescient view of the collapse of high capitalism. The unhinged Catholic Frank White does actually wish to perform major altruistic deeds for charity that will genuinely help the poor and needy, who are always visible on the periphery of the action in King of New York. Yet White realizes that the only way to effect real change within the crumbling and utterly corrupt American capitalist system is through violent entrepreneurial criminal endeavor. Frank White desires to establish a new order, wiping away the empty pretensions of the Italian mob, romanticized 20 years before by Coppola in The Godfather, and the ruthless and highly immoral Chinese triads and Colombian drug dealers and pimps who exploit their own people. Obviously, the new established crime underworld, that the doomed White releases he can never really achieved, would be ruled by the Jesus-fixated Frank White, through the sale of a dangerous, uncontrollable EO product. Well, it's a tough job, but somebody's got to do it, White lectures a handcuffed Roy Bishop. For all of Frank White's talk of constructing a new hospital, the building is only glimpsed as a large illustration at a fundraising dinner and upon a cake presented to him at a celebrity-studded function. Of course, ultimately, the King of New York belongs to Christopher Walken. His performance as Frank White, a nod here, a sly wink there, and a half-executed gesture is a master class of resigned, quicksilver, minimal reaction and a mysterious otherness that is utterly unique to Walken. No other character in King of New York can ever be sure of what he is thinking behind his dead-eyed gaze or what he will do next. Though at ease at social functions and charity fundraising balls, Frank White's natural habitat is the New York subway. Shortly after his release from prison, White takes his WASP girlfriend down to the subway train for sex, and when interrupted by black amateur teenage muggers, he further corrupts them by offering gainful employment within his organization, located at the Plaza Hotel. The dark Stygian depths of the New York subway, beautifully shot by Bazelli, suit the vampire-like Frank White, and their tunnels are his conduit to hell and his final confrontation with Bishop. This special Arrow Films edition of The King of New York on Blu-ray/DVD features a highly spirited commentary by the renegade director Ferrara. "This is so far out in Brooklyn you need a passport to get there," the director comments on the scene where Jimmy Jump and his sidekick are arrested in a fast food joint. "We had to take all the bulletproof glass out of the place. Right around the corner was the Black Hells Angels Club. Imagine that." At the close of the picture, Ferrara plays an acoustic guitar and sings a rowdy version of School Lead's "EO King of New York." The special edition also contains with other extensive extras. These include another revealing audio commentary featuring composer Joe Delia, producer Mary Kane, casting director Randy Sabusawa and Ferrara's regular editor Anthony Redman, who takes great delight in every scene of skillfully choreographed violence, a short film about the long career of Abel Ferrara, a documentary that includes interviews with his key collaborators, Abel Ferrara, Not Guilty, an excellent documentary from the French TV show Cinq copyright Astes de Notre Temps Blu-ray only, which follows the director around the streets of Manhattan as he works and plays, an interview with the film's Italian producer Augusto Caminito. Ferrara states that the $5 million budget for the film was raised over one dinner in Italy, and a new exclusive interview with Ferrara. Gangster movies have become a somewhat of a Freudian rite of passage for young men. Every growing boy need to frantically go through them until they figure out their own stance on the uber masculinity and the violence displayed in these audiovisual tales of crime. I was a late bloomer to that experience, like for many other thing in my life. I didn't see the Godfather trilogy until I was 18, 23 for Scarface, and I hadn't watched King of New York until last weekend. It's not a movie that introduces itself very well. If it wasn't wearing Abel Ferrara's signature of violent mayhem, I probably would have skipped it. Speaking of violent mayhem might be underselling King of New York though, so that's why it's awesome in a crass and immature way. Frank White, Christopher Walken, is a psychopathic drug lord who just got released from prison. He's also absurdly self-aware, and wants to make up for all these years he lost rolling his thumbs behind bars. So what does Frank White do? He announced his big comeback with trumpets, shotguns and foot soldiers, by gunning down every other drug dealer and organized crime figures in town. But what nobody seems to get about the triumphant return of New York's most bloodthirsty mobster is that he's got the greater picture in mind. Frank White wants to use his talents to benefit his city and gather money to pay for hospitals and infrastructures, which seems to piss off the local cops way past the breaking point of their rationality. Apparently, King of New York is an urban retelling of Robin Hood, except that it only bears a vague conceptual resemblance with the folk tale. It's not a subtle movie. The characters aren't refined or complicated. In fact, the best thing King of New York has for itself are the spectacular action scenes that include some poor devil getting his face rammed into a fire hydrant, a low-budget shootout in Chinatown where both gangs just stand in the street and mow each other down with automatic weapons, and, last but not least, an epic gunfight/discussion about thugs' food preference under an overpass. King of New York is no achievement in screenwriting, but the savage vision of director Abel Ferrara transforms what would be run-of-the-mill scenes and details into unique and memorable moments. It's that kind of random surprise that makes it worth your while. King of New York wouldn't be as flavorful as it was without its cops though. Screenwriter Nicholas St. John has written the nastiest, more deviant, and bloodthirsty cops south of James Ellroy novels, and you guys know how crazy I am about the author of the El Dada Quartet. The character played by David Caruso and Wesley Snipes, I never really bothered learning their names, have no respect for human lives and will barge into the frame of every scene like a pack of hungry wolves, looking to paint the town with the blood of their enemies. Seriously, they are the angriest bunch of coppers in the history of cinema. They are devoured by the feeling of injustice because Frank White gets to help people by killing gangsters, which I believe they thought was their job in the first place. If you ever need inspiration for out-of-control cops, King of New York should be the first thing you turn to. If you're still not sure of what King of New York is like, think of it as Scarface's mannerless little cousin, and New Jack City's older, more tormented brother. It's a movie that completely lacks inhibition, yet that found a way to forge its own style from it. I don't know if it makes sense, but what I mean is that you'll need an open mind and a sharp sense of humor to appreciate the absolute wackiness of King of New York. I could also describe it to you as Carlito's Way with a Looney Tunes logic. It's by far not a feat in screenwriting, but it's boyish and crass and it does a lot with very little. The biggest star of King of New York would be without a doubt director Abel Ferrara, whose brash visual style helped the movie attain cult status. It's worth sitting through at least once, I believe. Gangster Frank White is released from prison after a long stint inside and looks to regain control of New York City by taking out rival gangs. When mob leaders start turning up dead, a group of policemen decide to take the law into their own hands to take down the rising kingpin of the New York criminal underworld. Neo-noir crime thriller King of New York throws the viewer into the inner workings of the urban, New York underworld as Frank White rubs shoulders with the elite by day and gets his hands bloody by night. First things first about this film, what an absolute stonker of a cast. Your eyes will be on stalks at the opening credits as the names roll down the screen, listing such talent as Larry Fishburne, how Laurence Fishburne was known in his younger acting days, Wesley Snipes, David Caruso, Steve Buscemi, Giancarlo Esposito, and Victor Argo, with Christopher Walken taking the titular crown as Frank White. If Walken is the king, Larry Fishburne is definitely the prince, stealing every single scene he's in as the head henchman with swagger, Jimmy Jump. With his hat sitting upon his head, chunk gold chain hanging around his neck and matching gold teeth, Jimmy's visage matches his personality perfectly as he travels around the city taking out White's opponents to consolidate his boss's status as top dog. In contrast to his lieutenant Jimmy, Frank White looks nothing like your typical mobster, but don't let the inches-high bouffant fool you. Behind those steely eyes is a calculating, clever man who's always one step ahead of his rivals. However, White is different from your ordinary gangster. He seems to have a heart, at least, and is bothered when there's talk of a local hospital closing down, stating that healthcare should be for all, not just for the rich. Talking about his aspirations to be mayor of New York City, White has some grand plans. Whether he wants to take control to give back to his community or to just hold power over the entire city is not entirely clear. He seems more motivated than his rivals who are only out for themselves. White, it appears, is looking to improve his community and give others a chance, especially seeing how much the community has gone downhill whilst he was in prison. New gangs have popped up, taking over street corners and peddling drugs on what was once his turf. White's crew, led by his animated lieutenant, have been picking off the smaller outfits whilst White was away, but now he's back. They're looking to clean out the entire city to put White firmly on the throne. Gritty, savage, and merciless are just a few words to describe King of New York. There's no pleasantries here, but neither is everything black or white. The people in high places are just as corrupt as the gangs, and even the police aren't straight with a penchant for taking things into their own hands. Despite knowing how ruthless White can be, you can't help but side with him and Jimmy Jump as they face off against the other gangs and even NYC cops Dennis Gilly and Thomas Flanagan, played by David Caruso and Wesley Snipes respectively. Annoyed at how White is escaping their grasp and continuing to pick off the opposition, Gilly and Flanagan decide they need to play White at his own game, despite their chief, Roy Bishop, Victor Argo, warning them not to. It seems like there's history between Bishop and White, with Bishop's goal to take down White once and for all but through the correct police procedure, whereas Bishop's men are prepared to break the law themselves and get their hands dirty to get White's crew once and for all. Gilly and Flanagan come off as bigger jerks than White's gang, which makes the viewer side with White until we witness White and Jimmy killing without remorse. What's evident here is that there's no winners, just losers, with death looming in the midst for every single one of them. It's only a matter of time. There's never a dull moment in Abel Ferrara's slickly shot crime thriller. King of New York maintains a tempo that never misses a beat as it takes you on White's journey to the top. It feels unrelenting and real, giving you an inside look at life on the streets, resulting in 103 minutes of cinema that just simply flies by. The performances are exceptional with captivating interactions during the quieter moments as well as the action-packed, bullet-ridden scenes. It's bold and brash at times, but nothing can quite top the scenes of intimidation between two rival outfits as you wonder who'll be the one to react first. The night's neon-lit city landscape comes alive in Arrow Video's stunning Blu-ray 4K restoration, approved by Abel Ferrara and cinematographer Bohan Bazelli. However, the default LPCM stereo audio track that accompanies it is a bit too muddy to be able to hear exactly what the cast are saying. Fortunately, the 5.1 audio track is a definite improvement and brings together all the elements of the sounds of the city whilst allowing the dialogue to be heard clearly. The film is also available in 4K UHD if you're looking for extra visual clarity. The disc itself comes with interviews with director Abel Ferrara and producer Augusto Caminito, alongside a couple of documentaries about Ferrara's work. 2 audio commentaries, one with Ferrara and the other with composer Joe Delia, producer Mary Kane, casting director Randy Sabusawa and editor Anthony Redman, round off the disc with TV spots, trailers, and an image gallery. The release itself comes with a reversible sleeve featuring newly commissioned artwork by Tracy Ching, whilst the first run contains an illustrated collector's booklet containing essays on the film by Ian Sinclair and Abel Ferrara biographer Brad Stevens. In a move itself worthy of a gangster movie, maverick New York film director Abel Ferrara once flew to Italy, sat down in a restaurant with a financier, and watched as he wrote out a check for $5 million. After years in development, that wedge of funding finally led the crime thriller King of New York to the screen in 1990. It wasn't a big hit at the time, it was largely eclipsed by the thematically similar but less memorable New Jack City. But by now, Ferrara's opus has acquired legendary cult status, headed up by Christopher Walken's colossal turn as the smooth-moving boss of a multiracial gang of cocaine dealers. It's a film beloved by rappers and connoisseurs of 90s cinema. Ferrara distanced himself from it somewhat after its release, dismissing King of New York as being too polished, slick and commercial. He once said it was initially inspired by The Terminator and a packed cinema's reaction to its relentless pace. All the same, it remains an imperfect but electrifying film, both thanks to its performance and its offbeat take on a genre already dominated by the likes of Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese. Walken plays Frank White, a drug lord who emerges older but unbowed from a lengthy spell in Sing Sing prison. Returning to Manhattan, he both resumes his life of luxury. He has a seemingly permanent suite at the Plaza Hotel, and sets about on an oddly personal one-year mission to make something good. He even appears to have designs on becoming New York's mayor. Meeting up with his old gangland compatriots, whose number includes the charismatically sociopathic Jimmy Jump, Laurence Fishburne, White sets about wiping out rival gangs, taking their money with the plan to spend the takings on changing the city for the better. In one scene, White meets Triad boss Larry Wong, Joey Chin, at a New York children's hospital, and tries to lay out a scheme that involves moving a huge quantity of cocaine and donating some of the proceeds to a worthy cause. It's a plan the Chinese-American gangster mockingly rebuffs. If I was into socialized medicine, I'd have stayed in Peking province. You know something, Frank? This conversation made me realize how fucking crazy you are. Unperturbed, White sends his henchmen out on a bloody rampage, gunning down rivals and taking their cash. It's a campaign that places White in the police's crosshairs. But when their attempts to bring down White through legal channels fall apart, they too resort to more violent methods. King of New York is enlivened hugely by a number of standout performances. There's Walken, obviously, all weird blow-dried hair and long, unblinking looks. He's a mercurial character who talks at a whisper one moment and punching bullets into his enemies and roaring with anger the next. You're all welcome to join. Arguably his equal, though, is Fishburne's Jimmy Jump, a cackling, fast-talking hoodlum who steals every scene and makes every line given to him instantly quotable. Quentin Tarantino once compared Fishburne's performance to a young Marlon Brando, and rightly pointing out that the actor himself should be credited for his unforgettable swagger and dress sense, bowler hat, leather jacket, chunky gold chain. Jimmy Jump, Tarantino says, is nothing less than the first hip-hop gangster in movie history. He invented that character. Crowded into smaller roles, the cast is similarly studded with actors who went on to bigger things. Wesley Snipes and David Caruso star alongside Scorsese veteran Victor Argo as the cops on White's trail. Giancarlo Esposito and Steve Buscemi make brief appearances as White's gang members, as does Harold Perrineau, later of lost fame, as a mugger whom White employs as one of his henchmen. Beyond being a showcase for some terrific acting, and Bohan Baseli's often exquisite cinematography, it's initially a little difficult to pin down exactly what Ferrara and co-writer Nicola St. John were trying to say with King of New York. White is sort of a Robin Hood figure, but he's also mercilessly violent, although the people White and his gang kill aren't exactly saints. The cops rightly want to put a stop to White's criminal exploits, but their vigilante approach also makes them criminals. Talking to writer Nicole Bernay for a 2022 interview, Ferrara suggested that Frank White is more of a metaphor for a particular kind of wealthy New Yorker than a realistic depiction of a gangster. How realistic is the film? Ferrara asked, rhetorically. You can't get out of jail and take over the Italian mob in 3 days. The metaphor's about a guy who's saying, okay, my money's going to build hospitals. We're gonna pull people together. We're gonna be a socialist mob. It's a lot of contradictions. White may have emerged from prison with grand ideas, but as Ferrara puts it, saying you're going to build a hospital and building a hospital are two different things. Many of Ferrara's films prior to 1990 depicted the city from a working-class angle. The increasingly unstable artist of 1979's The Driller Killer, played by the director himself, the seamstress turned vigilante in MS.45, 1981, the street-level cops and club bosses of Fear City, 1984. In King of New York, Ferrara and St. John contrast the lives of working-class cops with those of the wealthy, with their luxury hotels, stretch limos, fancy nightclubs, and charity benefit gigs, featuring R&B singer Freddie Jackson as himself. Thanks to his money and power, White can move freely through these places. even though he's an ex-convict and murderer. Apart from his line of work, White is largely interchangeable with the rich Wall Street bankers and dodgy politicians whose circles he finds himself in. King of New York is about the working class cops versus the nouveau riche drug dealers who are there for a brief moment, flaunting the bullshit money that they have. In one sense, King of New York could be seen as a mockery of trickle-down economics, the idea that allowing the rich to increase their wealth, rather than redistributing it through taxation, ultimately benefits the rest of society. Advocates of the theory suggest that it will create more jobs, as White does when he throws a bunch of bills at some muggers, instantly recruiting them as his workers. Or that the wealthy will voluntarily spread their wealth around through donations to charitable causes, like White's plan to build or fund hospitals. We can't know whether White would have ever followed through on his scheme, because events soon take a bloody turn. But what we do see is that White spends his time in bubbles, either looking down at the city from his penthouse suite or hived off in the back of his limo. He doesn't see the effects the drugs he helps proliferate around the city have. He never sees firsthand the impact of his violent gang war on ordinary communities and families. King of New York also captures Manhattan in the process of change. The poverty and crime that underscored Ferrara's earlier movies was in the process of being gentrified to the fringes. While Ferrara was still working on the script in the 1980s, Italian gangsters like John Gotti were still a familiar sight on the city's streets. Within a few years, a crackdown on organized crime sent the likes of Gotti to prison. The murder rate in New York City, which peaked at around the 2,200 mark in 1990, gradually fell to the low hundreds in the 2000s and 2010s. In the process, the people who hold the money and power have changed, but the bubble that protects them still remains. The wealth is still concentrated in the hands of the few. Or, as Ferrara says of King of New York, it was a brief look at a prosperity that wasn't ours. We were blue-collar people. They might throw us some crumbs now and then, but, at its purest level, King of New York is about power, those who possess it, and those who don't. The cops, frustrated and indignant at White's hypocrisy, use violence to eventually take him and his operation down. But White is simply one mover in a power system filled with other people like him. They may not be gangsters, necessarily, but as King of New York points out, it doesn't much matter where the money comes from. Simply possessing enough of it buys you access and privilege that ordinary folks can only dream of. Drug kingpin Frank White, Christopher Walken, has been released from prison and is again on the streets of New York City. Frank might say that he's gone straight, but, as soon as he's free, he's partying with his old crew, including Laurence Fishburne, Steve Buscemi, Giancarlo Esposito, and others. While Frank's agent, Paul Calderone, goes to all of the other city's gangsters and explains that they can either get out of Frank's way or die. 3 detectives, Victor Argo, David Caruso, and Wesley Snipes, make plans to take Frank out by any means necessary. Meanwhile, Frank is donating money to politicians, building hospitals, and presenting himself as New York's savior. King of New York is the epitome of a cult film. Directed by Abel Ferrara, the dark and violent King of New York was originally dismissed by critics and struggled to find an audience during its initial theatrical run. It was lumped in with and overshadowed by other 1990 gangster films like Goodfellas and Godfather Part 3. But it was later rediscovered on both cable and home video, and now it's rightly considered to be a stone-cold crime classic. Walken gives one of his best performances as Frank White, and that's not a surprise. The film was clearly made to give Walken a chance to show off what he could do with a lead role, and Walken captures Frank's charisma and humor without forgetting that he's essentially a sociopath. Walken gives a performance that feels like James Cagney updated for the end of the 80s. What's even more impressive is that all of the supporting characters are just as memorable as Walken's Frank White. From Laurence Fishburne's flamboyant killer to David Caruso's hot-headed cop to Paul Calderon's slippery agent to Janet Julian's morally compromised attorney, everyone gives a strong performance. I'm usually not a Caruso fan, but he's legitimately great here. They come together to bring the film's world to life. Everyone has their own reason for obsessing on Frank White and his return to power. I've always especially appreciated Victor Argo as the weary, veteran detective who finds himself trapped by Caruso and Wesley Snipes' impulsive plan to take down Frank White. Frank White and the cops go to war and it's sometimes hard to know whose side to be on. Director Abel Ferrara has had a long and storied career, directing films about morally ambiguous people who are often pushed to extremes. Personally, I think King of New York is his best film, a portrait of not just a criminal but also of a city that combines the best and the worst of human nature. The action is exciting, the cast is superb, and Frank's justifications for his behavior sometimes make a surprising amount of sense. Thought there's occasionally been speculation that it could happen, there's never been a sequel to King of New York and it doesn't need one. King of New York is a film that tells you all that you need to know about Frank White and the city that he calls home. Crazy. Brilliant. Violent. Hilarious. Badass. This is Major Walken. One of his meatiest roles. Eons of screen time, a cascade of great lines, and a double handful of perfect cinematic moments. In short, this is necessary Walken. Newly released from prison, Frank White, Walken, is a crime boss looking to do more than reclaim his previous status and drug territory, with the aid of his crazy right-hand man Jimmy Jump, Laurence Fishburne. He also wants to save a local public hospital from being shut down, because although he acts a bit like a vicious sociopath towards his enemies, he also has a soft spot for helping the regular, law-abiding citizens of New York. Abel Ferrara, this is the first time that Abel and Chris worked together. They went on to create 3 other films, The Addiction, 1995, The Funeral, 1996, and New Rose Hotel, 1998. All well worth watching, but especially The Funeral. It's dark, pitch black really, but Walken's the lead and there are so many great performances. Such an underappreciated film. Nicholas St. John, he also wrote the next 2 Ferrara/Walken projects, but not the last, New Rose Hotel, which is actually based on a short story by the godfather of cyberfiction William Gibson. This is wisely rated R. There's sex, violence, drugs, sometimes all at the same time. Lots of it too. Sex. Mostly bared bras teases and thonged butt ccs. Drugs. People can't shovel coke into their brain fast enough, also a couple of joints are passed around. Violence. Yes. A few in particular die a more grisly death than the other 370 or so, but yeah, it gets bloody. Walken specifically. I don't believe we see him do coke, but he may take a couple puffs when it comes around. He's a businessman, here. And he's too classy to fool around with that. He's got other things on his mind than getting high. Oh, but he loves the ladies. His personal bodyguards are all women, and they may or may not be high-class prostitutes, but they are all deadly. Also, his lawyer? Totally hot. There's one scene where Walken turns on the charm and seduces her in a deserted subway. Keep in mind, there aren't too many semi-graphic, she gets topless, he gets to second base, sex scenes out there with Walken in them, but this is one of them. To describe Abel Ferrara as something of a cinematic enfant terrible would be something of a devastating understatement. Hell, the fact that he made Driller Killer alone marks him out as a supremely edgy talent, but when you consider that he also made such controversial works as Rape Revenge Flick, Ms. 45 and the Harvey Keitel New Day-thon, Bad Lieutenant, his is a voice that's impressively nihilistic. However, while his personal brand of morals-free storytelling has never been for everyone, his stylish, 1990s gangster film, King of New York was something weirdly different. Sure, it has all the debauchery and lack of respect for human life seen in such other lawless epics as Goodfellas or Scarface, but there's something different going on under its slick skin that marks it out as a film that's not quite as simple as the usual, rags to riches to jail/dead, path gangster movies usually take. Frank White is charismatic, a drug lord who has just emerged from prison after a long sentence with big plans running through his brain. He's barely been back out into the world for a single night before he's met up with his trigger-happy right-hand man, Jimmy Jump, and started forging ahead to ruthlessly consolidate power by offering his rivals harsh ultimatums that are usually underlined by a hail of bullets. After turning a Colombian drugs baron into a sticky red stain on a sofa, Frank next turns his attention to an incredibly racist mafia boss who soon gets the same treatment. However, there's more going on here than Frank just obliterating the competition, but as he turns his attention to the triads, there's another party who are just itching to take White off the board once and for all, the NYPD Narcotics Squad. Led by the over-emotional Gilly and backed up by the cynical Bishop and the loyal Flanagan, there's a group of cops who are growing increasingly frustrated with White walking the streets with impunity, and they soon plan to get him and his gun-waving cronies of the streets of New York by any means necessary. However, the twist is that even though Frank is rushing around, viciously making the streets run red with blood, he's doing it in order to not only ultimately go straight, but to actually try and do some good in the world by taking out criminals who make their living by more unsavory means than just the drug trade. Of course, Gilly and his group of cops couldn't give the slightest of shits about any of this, and plan to storm one of Frank's clubs in an attempt to assassinate him, unaware of the pain and devastation they're about to bring down on everyone involved. Cold, enigmatic, and supremely aloof, Ferrara's King of New York is more of an art house stab at the modern mob movie than the sum of the more populist examples that existed at the time. But while Scorsese and De Palma took the lives of charismatic criminals to glossy extremes, Ferrara chooses to a more minimalist route, leaving the motives of its complex lead more nebulous than just desiring money and power. Yes, the vaguely reptilian Frank is trying to go legit, but it feels less like a character trait and more like Ferrara is drawing metaphorical parallels with himself as he slowly rises from the grotty mean streets of low-budget grunge horror to something more prestigious. However, Ferrara is still Ferrara after all, and he seems to be massively enjoying blurring those moral lines to such an exaggerated point that discerning good from bad is virtually impossible. Frank may be as cold-blooded as a refrigerated snake, but when he isn't violently purging the criminal underworld from those who dabble in child prostitution and human trafficking, he's trying to get funding sorted for a community hospital. Further adding more layers than an onion wearing a puffer jacket, the movie also interestingly has its anti-hero work with a crew predominantly made up of black men, which, for a genre that tends to include a lot of people with highly racist attitudes, is quite novel. This seems to tie directly the film's themes that insist no one is truly evil, just as much as no one can possibly be good, hence we get Frank's bizarre, Robin Hood mentality harshly rubbing up against the fact that he's a drug peddler who is obviously violently sociopathic, which is mirrored by the police who will happily flaunt the law to out and out execute the guy. To be totally honest, while it's a deeply interesting experience, it doesn't always make a hell of a lot of sense, but when you have an insanely hungry cast such as this, Ferrara's arthouse logic becomes a virtue, rather than a burden. In the center of it all, standing with his legs wide apart and liable to break out in dance at any moment, is Christopher Walken's Frank, who is as reliably as wild as you could possibly hope. Sporting an almost vertical frizz and an inhuman glare, he not only slots neatly into Ferrara's world, he powers it like a cackling dynamo. It seems to be catching, as almost matching him for sheer energy is Laurence Fishburne's riotous Jimmy Jump, that sees the actor utterly unrestrained as White's shoot first ask questions never number two. While anyone who's familiar with the actor knows the dude likes to chew the scenery a little with that characteristically booming voice, the gold-toothed, trash-talking, murderous Jimmy is probably the most extreme the actor has ever been, and yet, once again, it still works within the context of the film. Elsewhere, the rest of the cast is peppered with some big names in smaller roles that sees the likes of David Caruso, Wesley Snipes, Steve Buscemi, and Giancarlo Esposito strut their stuff as the movie often veers into vague Lynchian territory. Who else but Ferrara would stage a meeting between Frank's man and the triads in a cinema that's showing the 1922 Nosferatu. While maybe a bit too abstruse for those hoping for more standard criminal practices, King of New York still manages to bring the visceral thrills when it needs to. A car chase / shootout in the rain is particularly memorable, to offset its more stranger leanings. While maybe not the undisputed king of the American crime movie, King of New York certainly is memorable enough to confidently hold court. Abel Ferrara's King of New York, 1990, doesn't open with a bang but with a quiet, uneasy rumble, the kind of silence that feels stolen. The first thing we hear is the low grind of prison gates. Frank White, Christopher Walken, dressed like a shadow, steps out not like a man coming home, but like someone who slipped out of a grave nobody knew was there. He doesn't blink. He barely seems to breathe. In this world, Frank doesn't make an entrance, he rises. He climbs, literally and otherwise, through the film like a ghost, convinced the living still owe him something. Walken's Frank has seen things you wouldn't want to imagine. His performance here is the stuff legends are made of. Much has been written about King of New York as a gangster film, as an urban opera of violence and power set in New York City. But what sets it apart and what makes it worthy of the same breath as Melville's L.A. Samurai or Scorsese's Mean Streets is its refusal to moralize or mythologize its subject. Like some of the best films, we get an inside look at another world without any judgment. Instead, Ferrara drags the genre through a psychic underworld of Catholic guilt, capitalist rot, and spiritual collapse, themes he revisits time and again throughout his other work, such as Bad Lieutenant. But King of New York is my favorite Ferrara movie, as I feel it encapsulates all of his obsessions in the most self-realized way. It's a film where the guns are loud but the silences scream louder, where the city is both crucible and cathedral to the viewer. Frank White is not Tony Montana. He is not Michael Corleone. Frank is a man who has seen the other side and has come back not with wisdom, but with obsession. He wants to clean up New York by ruling it. He wants to fix the system with the very tools that broke it. This is the paradox, that this impossible reconciliation of power and virtue is what drives him. He builds hospitals with drug money. He assassinates rivals while quoting civic duty. Moreover, Frank sees himself not as a king, but as a redeemer with a ledger. He performs the acts that he has taken upon himself that others don't want to do. And Christopher Walken plays the character really well, skewing the moral ambiguities with his facial expressions. The film understands that power is always haunted. Ferrara is not interested in the mechanics of crime, but in its theology. Every frame pulses with moral ambiguity. The cinematography by Bohan Baseli is drenched in chiaroscuro half-lit faces, blood flickering in strobe, and figures swallowed by shadow. It's a film of ghosts and silhouettes, of men chasing control through corridors already haunted by their own consequences. But perhaps the most revealing moment in King of New York, and one of its most enigmatic, isn't a shootout or monologue. It's the "what's in the cup" scene. The moment arrives without warning. The cup becomes a kind of vessel, not just for its unknown contents, but for everything Frank is refusing to articulate. What's in the cup? Maybe it's just soda. Maybe it's nothing, or maybe it really is root beer. But whatever it is, it clings to something sacred in Frank: his distance, his appetite, the slow, deliberate rot that pulls him deeper into the underworld. In that moment, the cup is the comedic relief. The scene itself has become a meme. It's quotable and otherwise funny and stands out in this movie in tone. It tells us more about Frank's inner world than any of his pronouncements of justice or loyalty. That scene lingers precisely because it resists explanation. It's a surreal beat, almost Lynchian in its rhythm. Before the internet, a lot of indie films used to have at least one or two very memorable, meme-worthy type scenes that would stick with you afterwards. And like much of King of New York, it plays on the edge of dream logic. The world of the film is grounded in brutal reality, but the tone drifts into something mythic. As Frank picks off his enemies and watches his allies fall, we begin to see the architecture of his self-mythology crumble. The man who thought he could rule New York like a philosopher king ends up alone, bleeding out in the back seat of a yellow cab, chased underground like the very criminals he once condemned. There's no glory in it. Just silence, flashing lights, and the city continuing without him. This is Ferrara's ultimate achievement. King of New York is not a cautionary tale. It is not a morality play. It is something far more unsettling, a study of a man who believes the city owes him transcendence, and who discovers that all the money, violence, and power in the world cannot buy absolution. Frank White is not punished for being evil, he is punished for believing that he could be good. In the decades since its release, King of New York has only grown more vital. The promise and hopes of a new decade couldn't have lasted long in the early hours of the 1990s, if they even existed at all. Distrust of institutions was only strengthened during the Reagan years, when American exceptionalism was pushed upon the world, while the country's poor were largely left to fend for themselves. The oppressive war on drugs only seemed to cause further damage to impoverished communities, while a new Bush presidency wasn't exactly a tonic. The only ones who seemed to flourish in the 1980s were the already wealthy businessmen. Abel Ferrara's King of New York is the bridge from one decade into the next, a borderline nihilistic cry of shame and frustration. It's a film directly informed by 1980's divisive politics, following feared drug lord Frank White, Christopher Walken, after his release from a long stint in prison, looking to regain control of the city. He also wishes to do some manner of good, in the form of saving children's hospitals, and taking out drug cartels who earn their money dirtily well, more dirtily than him. If Goodfellas, released the same year, was the process of a gangster losing his soul to one of the systems that runs America, then King of New York is the process of a gangster trying to reclaim that soul. If Frank White even has a soul is an open question. King of New York is as much about moral and spiritual corruption as it is about literal corruption, although there's plenty of the latter, too. Detectives Gilly, David Caruso, Bishop, Victor Argo, and Flanagan, Wesley Snipes, pursue Frank and his crew with reckless aplomb. Bishop is by the books, but Gilly and Flanagan are something closer to vigilantes, personally offended by Frank's swagger and cockiness and dedicated to destroying him even if it means storming a safe house with shotguns and bags over their heads. Gilly claims he's just trying to keep the streets safe, but it's a transparent claim. Embarrassment at his own ineffectualness radiates from him. It's only a short fall from respected member of society to running around on the streets with firearms. Ferrara draws clever parallels between the different levels of power in New York. Frank isn't far removed from the frustrations of the police force. Their fury comes from their desire to be taken seriously as upholders of law, while Frank's fury comes from his frustration that he can't be taken seriously as a legitimate businessman. When he expresses his desire to become the mayor of New York, he's laughed at, while his suggestion that he could save a soon-to-be foreclosed children's hospital is scoffed at. But here Ferrara makes an important distinction. Frank's supposedly rebuffed by congressmen because of the nefarious ways he makes his money, but in reality, it's simply doubt he has the money, rather than anything virtuous. Once he shows that he does have the cash, the phrase blood money seems to slip conveniently from the minds of the congressmen. It illustrates a dark truth in business, that enough money will abate the worries about where it came from. Be it through throwing cash at a situation, or through using excessive firepower, the frustrations of Frank, his crew, the police, and the local government can all be briefly squashed. It's a damning indictment on Ferrara's part, an incendiary device designed to reveal just how corrupt systems of power are, and that the ultimate pursuit of capital gain and control destroys any notion of moral superiority. Nobody's fighting fair. What elevates Ferrara's film, and makes it such a complex study of character is that, though it teeters on the brink of hopelessness, it never fully takes the plunge. Underlying Frank's cold, steely stare is an aching shame. Call it a product of Ferrara's Catholic upbringing, or perhaps a more immediate anxiety about one's role in systems of oppression, but King of New York is utterly haunted by regret. Walken has perhaps one of the most distinctive faces in cinema, but his abilities as an actor go far beyond the recognizable traits of his look. When he's first reunited with his crew, Frank grins, but Walken never loses the look of pain in his eyes. He yelps, dances and plays with them, but when the smile drops, the shadow falls over his face again and we don't see a frightening, powerful man. We see one who is truly lost. Ferrara's dialogue is transactional and businesslike, so it's not dialogue but performance that brings out the notes of tragedy in the story. With his shock of black hair and stilted yet deliberate delivery, Walken seems less like a mob boss from our world and instead more gestural, expressive, and unusual. It's no coincidence that amongst gorgeously framed images of Frank pining over a distant and dark city, some of the crew go to a screening of Nosferatu, 1922. Be it the manner in which Frank drains the city with a needle in place of fangs, or in the self-imposed isolation that he nocturnally watches the world, but Frank is very much a vampire, villainous but tragic, and oddly sympathetic. Of course, Christopher Walken would go on to play a literal vampire in Ferrara's incredible horror film The Addiction, 1995, and you can sense the seeds being planted here. In that film, his vampire, Pena, would claim to have found a way to kick his blood addiction, and there's a hopefulness in Frank, too. I want to do something good, he says, looking out at the city, the lights of which look weakened under a bruised and starless sky. But his experience tells him that doing something good doesn't mean going straight and getting out of syndicated crime, it means using the power he wields within it to fund something he can be proud of. But, of course, from the subterranean streets where he and his crew roam to the skyscraper penthouses where he makes deals, there really is no distinction. Reagan's appalling trickle-down economics theory is taken to task by Ferrara. There's no benefit to yield from the activities of these people besides the monetary gains they themselves enjoy. There's a direct pipeline connecting the power and money of New York, and any person outside of it receives nothing. I'm not your problem, I'm just the businessman, Frank tells Bishop. It's a grim statement designed to fuel hopelessness. It's the vampire in Frank coming out again. Frank is a man at war with himself, torn between cockily parading his remorselessness in front of anyone who'll listen, and trying to make up for the damage he's done. If he leaned further into the former, he might be like Jimmy Jump, Laurence Fishburne, Frank's biggest hype man and the film's largest character. He cackles and screams when wounded in a gunfight, he contemptuously hurls $10 bills at Flanagan and tells him to buy flowers for his witness. He owns the film whenever he's on screen. Fishburne takes a big swing with Jump and it's absolutely riveting to watch him strut and sneer his way through chaos. And yet, there he is, giving a $20 bill to a grandmother in a fast food joint and telling her to get her grandkids whatever they want. He and Frank share a strange kinship through their quasi-Robin Hood standing in the community, taking with one hand and giving with the other. It's a Mobius strip of necessity, crime, and absolution. Ferrara's directorial choices are frequently big swings, too. His set pieces are filled with women in cocktail dresses firing Uzis, and almost comical amounts of blood bathed in orange and blue lights. One of the most exciting sequences takes place on cobblestone streets in the pounding rain. In making violence look this alluring, Ferrara points towards the cheap, awful thrills that draw these men in. The film's pulp aesthetics never undermine its points because we understand that, as much as a comment on capitalism as it is, King of New York is also a broad, tragedy-on tale of downfall and attempted redemption. Ferrara pushes two colors forward throughout, orange and blue. And the contrast of these colors is no coincidence. On the streets, where the victims of Frank, of poverty and of oppressive power lies dying in the gutter, everything is blue. Above the city, in seemingly untouchable apartments, there is a warm orange that suggests heavenly redemption. Frank probably wonders often whether he's going there when he dies. But under any light, blood is red, no matter how it appears, and all money is covered in it. The daily grind continues. Guerrilla filmmaker Abel Ferrara's 1990 crime opus is a simultaneously gritty and flashy, no-holds-barred account of a man with no respect for laws, rules, or any kind of social order. Like his later masterpiece Bad Lieutenant, King of New York deals with an unsavory character having a crisis of conscience, but here it's internalist, held at bay beneath Christopher Walken's implacable death mask of a face. His spine-tingling performance combines with Ferrara's raw approach, largely filming without permits and with everyday people as extras, to create an ice-cold thriller that's as darkly funny as it is morally bankrupt. Frank White has just got out of jail for drug-related offenses, and immediately returns to his gangland fold. He finds his lackeys have remained loyal, but now he's aiming higher than dominating the criminal underworld once more. White has hopes to be New York's next mayor. He's shocked by how his beloved hometown is going to the dogs, dealers are getting more unscrupulous, hospitals are closing and a crack epidemic is sweeping the streets. White realizes he may have to use his drug money as muscle to fund a hospital's renovation, a gesture which would force the politicians to take his lofty goal seriously. Meanwhile, he's taking the anger generated by the years spent inside out on his rival gang lords, and ruffling the feathers of the increasingly frustrated police. White thinks he's cleaning up the streets, but his dubious crusade is being jeopardized at every turn by his inescapable infamy. Ferrara's take on the gangster movie is even more amoral than most. Aside from his crew, White has absolutely no regard for any of his peers and is completely deluded when it comes to his ambitions and the ramifications of his actions. He's a fascinating character, and a perfect showcase for Christopher Walken's serpentine menace. He's utterly magnetic, slinking through every scene with his utter contempt for everyone he encounters all too obvious. His motivation in rescuing the hospital is left intriguingly ambiguous. It's never clear whether he's doing this just to get into a position of power, or if he really is having a crisis of conscience. Ultimately though, Ferrara doesn't shy away from portraying White as a hedonistic and nefarious scumbag, and just about avoids glorifying his party-hard lifestyle, despite lingering on several scenes of half-naked mistresses and hard drug use, all to a blaring hip-hop soundtrack that's bang on the money for its period. Laurence Fishburne is on scene-snatching form as a brilliantly slimy hood, with his overblown 80s bling and ridiculous swagger masking a gleefully psychotic streak. He and Walken are gifted several standout scenes that are as cool as anything Tarantino would later attempt, and wickedly humorous in their brutality. These almost cartoonish moments give the whole film a charge of vicious energy. You're never sure when one of the gangsters is going to explode, and how far they'll go to take down their enemies. Elsewhere, an interesting conflict is established between the cops eager to bust White. The young rookies see no wrong in resorting to the sort of violence the mobster is perpetrating in order to take him down, while their superior tries to stick to the book lest they all end up as corrupt as their pursued. This culminates in some genuinely painful scenes, where the hunters realize they might not have the steel to deal with such hardened killers. David Caruso and Wesley Snipes are excellent as the fired-up young guards, while Victor Argo is note-perfect as the aging detective struggling to acclimatize to the chaos of the modern world. Where the film falters is in failing to keep control of its various plot strands and multitude of characters. Various Ferrara regulars appear several times but never really seem to be given much to do. White's lawyer-slash-lover is particularly poorly sketched and just disappears eventually, depriving the film of what little female interest it had. The final 20 minutes are a bullet-strewn blast, but they do stretch credulity to the limit, with a lengthy car chase in which ammunition appears to be unlimited. Ferrara wins his film up with a bleak whimper rather than a bang though, the director's trademark nihilism in full effect with an ending that offers no easy answers for any of the characters or the audience. Overall, King of New York is distinguished from similarly themed films by its willingness to embrace the gangster genre's exploitative nature. It's as shallow as a puddle but it's riveting viewing all the same. A clutch of amped-up performances enliven proceedings no end, and the director has an authentic feel for his city that sets him apart from the slightly rose-tinted style of Scorsese and Coppola. It's one of Walken's most memorable roles, and the film is a true cult classic. Without it there'd probably be no Reservoir Dogs. If you can handle the lack of sympathetic characters and the throwaway nature of the violence, Ferrara's unflinching thriller is one hell of a ride, and deserves recognition for its borderline satirical take on well-worn themes. Reviewed on September 9, 2011. A chronicler of the dark and nasty, some say sick, nature of modern urban life, Abel Ferrara perceives himself as a rowdy outsider, a rules breaker. His combative personality is reflected in films which fall into the crack between exploitation and art, hype and hip. His audience has been small but appreciative, a peculiar mix of the action and art house crowds. Ferrara began to be taken more seriously with King of New York, which was shown at the 1990 New York Film Fest, where it elicited walkouts, including Ferrara's own wife, along with commensurate praise. Ferrara's movies are morality tales, explorations of good and evil that offer only light suggestions of redemption. This theme received its most schematic and religious treatment in Bad Lieutenant, arguably his chef d'oeuvre. Thematically, if not stylistically, King of New York, 1990, Bad Lieutenant, 1992, and The Funeral, 1996, form some sort of an urban trilogy. Probably, no director in the contemporary American cinema has exhibited in his work such a gap between the dictates of his head and those of his gut. In film after film, Ferrara's high art and philosophical ambitions clash with his more natural disposition for low-life sleaze. This may be a result of his collaboration with an intellectual screenwriter, Nicola St. John, but also of undeniable pretensions as evidenced in the existential vampire film, The Addiction. Like Scorsese, who has cultivated a special relationship with De Niro, Ferrara has his own favorite ensemble. Christopher Walken is Ferrara's quintessential actor, an eerily entertaining mannerist whose specialty is the delivery of long monologues filled with weird intellectual and moral overtones. Combining a scary temper with balletic grace, good and bad impulses coexist within Walken's battling soul. In King of New York, Walken played a crime lord out to regain his turf, and in The Addiction, a tough-minded vampire mentor of a female recruit. As the family's leader in The Funeral, Walken played a murderer who declares contempt for flaws of the criminal mind just as he is about to kill someone. A virtuoso of grunge, Ferrara neglects narrative coherence, dramatic logic, and empathy. Technically, King of New York is his most stylish film, but emotionally, it's as vapid as Ms. 45 or Fear City. A lurid drama steeped in the bright lights and noisy rhythms of urban decadence, it's the story of a drug kingpin, Walken, who operates with venality and pragmatism. But he's also blessed with a streak of idealism, planning to strong-arm the city's drug lords into redistributing their money to the poor and building a hospital for them. These moral concerns are contained in ultra-violent movies, which is Hollywood's time-honored strategy, make anti-violence pictures by showing more of it. Ferrara's instincts are clearly on the side of mayhem, juicing everything up, exploiting urban fears. His expository, non-violent sequences often lack dramatic sense. He rehashes a perennial theme of crime films, the thin line between cops and criminals, though his screen cops exceed the norms. In Ferrara's world, ambiguity almost erases the distinction between cops and the debased world they are meant to serve. A chronicler of the dark and nasty, some say sick, nature of modern urban life, Abel Ferrara perceives himself as a rowdy outsider, a rules breaker. His combative personality is reflected in films which fall into the crack between exploitation and art, hype and hip. His audience has been small but appreciative, a peculiar mix of the action and art house crowds. Ferrara began to be taken more seriously with King of New York, which was shown at the 1990 New York Film Fest, where it elicited walkouts, including Ferrara's own wife, along with commensurate praise. Ferrara's movies are morality tales, explorations of good and evil that offer only light suggestions of redemption. This theme received its most schematic and religious treatment in Bad Lieutenant, arguably his chef d'oeuvre. Thematically, if not stylistically, King of New York, 1990, Bad Lieutenant, 1992, and The Funeral, 1996, form some sort of an urban trilogy. Probably, no director in the contemporary American cinema has exhibited in his work such a gap between the dictates of his head and those of his gut. In film after film, Ferrara's high art and philosophical ambitions clash with his more natural disposition for low-life sleaze. This may be a result of his collaboration with an intellectual screenwriter, Nicholas St. John, but also of undeniable pretensions as evidenced in the existential vampire film, The Addiction. Like Scorsese, who has cultivated a special relationship with De Niro, Ferrara has his own favorite ensemble. Christopher Walken is Ferrara's quintessential actor, an eerily entertaining mannerist whose specialty is the delivery of long monologues filled with weird intellectual and moral overtones. Combining a scary temper with balletic grace, good and bad impulses coexist within Walken's battling soul. In King of New York, Walken played a crime lord out to regain his turf, and in The Addiction, a tough-minded vampire mentor of a female recruit. As the family's leader in The Funeral, Walken played a murderer who declares contempt for flaws of the criminal mind just as he is about to kill someone. A virtuoso of grunge, Ferrara neglects narrative coherence, dramatic logic, and empathy. Technically, King of New York is his most stylish film, but emotionally, it's as vapid as Ms. 45 or Fear City. A lurid drama steeped in the bright lights and noisy rhythms of urban decadence, it's the story of a drug kingpin, Walken, who operates with venality and pragmatism. But he's also blessed with a streak of idealism, planning to strong-arm the city's drug lords into redistributing their money to the poor and building a hospital for them. These moral concerns are contained in ultra-violent movies, which is Hollywood's time-honored strategy, make anti-violence pictures by showing more of it. Ferrara's instincts are clearly on the side of mayhem, juicing everything up, exploiting urban fears. His expository, non-violent sequences often lack dramatic sense. He rehashes a perennial theme of crime films, the thin line between cops and criminals, though his screen cops exceed the norms. In Ferrara's world, ambiguity almost erases the distinction between cops and the debased world they are meant to serve. This film, directed by Abel Ferrara, written by Nicholas St. John, produced by Augusto Caminito, starring Christopher Walken, cinematography Bohan Bazelli, edited by Anthony Redman, music by Joe Delia, production companies Rete Italia, distributed by Carolco Pictures, release date September 28, 1990, running time 103 minutes, countries United States, language English, budget $5 million. Box office $2.6 million.